The morning they found two fresh graves with no names, Martha Crane was standing at the well washing her hands. That is where this story begins. Not with the graves, though the graves matter. Not with the men inside them, though they matter too. It begins with a woman at a well washing hands that the water couldn't seem to clean on a Saturday morning, so quiet you could hear the creek running clear and cold 300 yards away. Billy Ames was 12 years old and driving his father's cattle along the morning trail when he stopped. He stopped because something was wrong with the look of the Crane property that day, and even a 12-year-old boy who had never seen violence could feel the wrongness of it, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Two mounds of fresh-turned earth sat in the far corner of the property back near the fence line where the cottonwoods grew thin. No markers, no stones, no flowers, just dark red soil piled neatly over something large, and the grass around them pressed flat, as though heavy things had been dragged across it. Closer to the gate, a stain on the ground had dried to the color of rust. Two horses stood tied at the fence post, still saddled, still bridled. No riders had come to collect them. And at the well, 30 yards from the gate, Martha Crane stood with her back to the road. Her left arm was wrapped in clean white cloth from wrist to elbow. She was rinsing her hands in the bucket, slow and methodical, the way a person washes when they are not thinking about washing at all. She heard Billy stop. She didn't turn around. "Go on home, son," she said. Her voice was calm. "There's nothing here that needs looking at." Billy Ames went home. But he never forgot what he saw that morning, and when he was old and gray and sitting on his own porch, he would tell the story to his grandchildren the way you tell a story that changed something in you. He would say, "She didn't look like a woman who had just done something terrible. She looked like a woman who had just finished something necessary." His grandchildren never fully understood what he meant by that. But that is how legends work. They don't ask to be understood. They only ask to be remembered. To understand how two men ended up in the ground that Friday evening, you need to understand the land they came to take. And to understand the land, you need to understand the water. Montana Territory, 1884. The valley of Stillwater Bend sat between low mountains that turned blue in the distance, a place where three creeks came together in a single clear channel that ran year-round even in the driest summers. In a country where water meant everything, where cattle died and crops failed and men rode 50 miles for a reliable source, that creek was worth more than gold. It didn't look like much. It was maybe 10 feet wide at its broadest point, shallow enough to wade in summer, cold enough in winter to numb a man's hand in 30 seconds. But it ran clean and it ran constant, and the grass on either side of it stayed green from April through October, when the surrounding rangeland had gone brown and brittle. The Crane Ranch sat on 240 acres of that valley. It wasn't a grand property. The house was modest, built low against the hillside to catch the morning sun and block the north wind. The barn leaned slightly northward from 30 years of weather, a lean Jacob had always promised to fix and never quite got around to. There was a chicken coop, a root cellar, a smokehouse, and a kitchen garden that Martha kept with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. She had come to this land as a bride of 23 in the spring of 1852. When the territory was still contested ground, and a piece of paper from Washington meant considerably less than a faster gun. She and Jacob had built the place themselves, prying stones from the creek bed for the foundation, cutting timber from the lower slopes of the mountains, surviving winters that killed livestock, and summers that turned the rangeland to tinder. Jacob Crane had died 8 months before this story begins. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Martha knew it was the weight of 30 years of work that had finally settled into his lungs and stayed there. He was buried on a hillside that looked down over the creek under a stone she had carved herself. Just his name, just the years. Jacob would have wanted it plain. She had lived alone since November. Once a month she rode into Stillwater Bend for supplies. Flour, salt, sugar, ammunition. She paid in cash and spoke in short sentences and returned to the ranch the same day. The townspeople knew her as a woman who kept to herself. They knew she was capable in the ways that frontier women had to be capable. She could birth a calf or mend a roof or put down a lame horse without asking anyone for help. They knew she was alone on that property and that she had no intention of leaving it. What they didn't know was considerably more interesting. But that comes later. The trouble began the previous spring when men arrived in Stillwater Bend with money and plans, and the particular confidence of people who have never been told no in a language they understood. The Great Northern Land Syndicate, that was the name on their papers, though nobody in the valley had asked for their name, was backed by railroad capital and Eastern investors who saw the future running on steel rails and telegraph wire. They wanted the Creek Valley. They wanted to control the water that would make their cattle operations profitable, the water that would supply their work camps when the railroad pushed through the water that everything in this dry country ultimately depended on. They had already bought out 3 ranches in the valley. The methods varied. Old Hector Pruitt had taken the money willingly enough. He was 72, and his knees had given out, and his children had gone east. The Delman brothers had held out for 6 months before a series of fence cuttings and missing cattle persuaded them that the offer was reasonable after all. And Eliza Marsh had packed her 3 children into a wagon on a Tuesday morning and driven away without looking back because she had no husband and no options and 3 small mouths that needed feeding more than they needed principal. Martha had watched Eliza's wagon roll past the front gate of the Crane Ranch on that Tuesday morning. She had stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road. She had not waved. She had not called out. She had only stood and watched and then gone back inside to finish her breakfast. Alone, the Crane Ranch was the last holdout in the valley. It sat in the middle of the syndicate's planned route like a stone in a boot, not enough to stop progress but enough to make every step uncomfortable. Martha owned her land free and clear and had the papers to prove it, filed in Helena and certified by a judge who had not yet been purchased. She had made no secret of her position. She was not leaving. Warren Galt arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, 6 weeks before the events of this story's Friday evening. He was 44 years old, well-dressed in a way that looked intentional rather than natural, with clean hands and the kind of careful manners that come from years of telling people things they don't want to hear in the most pleasant voice available. He rode a good horse, and he sat it well, and he stopped outside Martha's gate without coming through it. That at least showed some judgment. Martha was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked around the side of the house and looked at him. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Crane, my name is Warren Galt. I represent the Northern Land Syndicate, and I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." Martha looked at him. She said nothing. Galt had done this before. Silence from the other party was usually a negotiating tactic, a way of drawing out a better offer. He took it as an invitation to continue, and laid out his proposal in clear, reasonable terms. The syndicate was prepared to offer a price well above market value. He mentioned the figure. It was genuinely a generous number. He acknowledged that the property held sentimental value. He expressed sympathy for her recent loss. He painted a picture of a comfortable life in town, free from the physical demands of running a ranch alone, well-funded and secure. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes without interruption. When he finished, Martha turned and walked back around the side of the house toward the kitchen garden. Galt sat on his horse for a moment. He looked at the closed gate in front of him and the empty yard beyond it, and the corner of the house around which a woman had just disappeared without a word. In 20 years of land acquisition, he had been cursed at, threatened, and on one occasion shot at. He had never been simply walked away from. He was not certain whether to be amused or troubled. He decided on troubled. He pulled his horse around and rode back toward town. Near the top of the first hill, he stopped and looked back at the property. The creek ran along the property line, catching the afternoon sun. The small house sat quiet and still below him. He rode on to Stillwater Bend and sent a telegram to Helena that evening. It said only, "Crane widow declines. Require alternative approach." The reply came the next morning. It was a single name, Hendricks. 3 days after Galt's visit, a letter arrived at the Crane Ranch by way of the county land office. Martha read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. It claimed that she owed back taxes on the property, a sum large enough to bankrupt the ranch 3 times over. The debt was described as overdue by 14 months. The signature at the bottom belonged to the county assessor, a man named Connors, who Martha had known for a decade as a moderately honest bureaucrat with a wife and 2 daughters. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table, finished her coffee, washed her cup, and saddled her horse. The land office in Stillwater Bend was on the main street between the hardware store and the telegraph office. Martha arrived before 10 in the morning and placed the letter on the counter in front of Thomas Connors, who was standing behind it with the expression of a man who has been dreading this particular moment for several weeks. "This debt is fabricated," Martha said. "You know it and I know it. I want to hear you say so." Connors looked at the letter. He looked at his hands. He did not look at Martha. "The debt is legal, Mrs. Crane," he said quietly. "Filed and recorded, due in 30 days. A long silence held the room. "Thomas," Martha said. Her voice had not changed in tone or volume. "Your oldest daughter is getting married in September. I was at the schoolhouse when she learned to read. Think carefully about what kind of man you want to be at that wedding." Connors looked up then. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already made his decision and was now living in the middle of it, unable to go back. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Crane," he said, and he meant it in the limited way that people mean things when meaning them costs nothing and changes nothing. Martha picked up the letter, folded it, placed it in her coat pocket. She rode home. That night she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper. The lamp burned low. Outside, the creek ran its quiet sound through the dark. Jacob's chair sat across the table from her, empty, in the way that only the chairs of dead people can be empty, not just unoccupied, but carrying the specific weight of absence. She thought about Connors and his soiled conscience. She thought about Eliza Marsh on that Tuesday wagon not looking back. She thought about the 30 years she and Jacob had put into this land, stone by stone and season by season, and the way the creek sounded on a summer morning when the light came off the water in pieces. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not yet think about the barn. She did not yet think about what was underneath the hay bales in the corner. But something had shifted that day. Quietly, without announcement, the way fault lines shift deep underground long before the surface knows anything has changed. The 30 days had begun. 2 weeks passed. Then 3 things happened in quick succession, each worse than the one before. The first was the fence. Martha found it on a Thursday morning, 2 sections of wire cut clean posts, splintered at the base as though kicked by a horse or struck with something heavy. A dozen head of cattle had wandered through the gap and were gone. She spent the better part of that day tracking them across the neighboring rangeland and driving them back, a task that would have been difficult with 2 people and was exhausting alone. She repaired the fence in the afternoon, working with her back to the wind, her hands bleeding from the wire. When she walked the line afterward, she found what she had expected to find. Hoof prints in the soft soil near the break, fresh, distinctive. One horse in the group had a cracked shoe on the right front, leaving a mark shaped like a broken crescent in the mud wherever the ground was soft enough to hold it. She followed the tracks with her eyes to where they led, straight toward the Stillwater Bend road. She stood there for a moment, looking in that direction, the wind moving the dry grass around her boots. She knew that print. She had seen that horse tied outside the saloon on her last supply run. She knew the man who rode it by name and by reputation. She turned around and walked back to the house, not because she was afraid, because she understood with a clarity that came from 30 years of hard living that there was a right time for every response, and this was not it. The second thing was the water. She found the steers on a Monday morning, 3 of them dead beside the stock trough. Their sides were bloated in the early summer heat, and the flies were already thick over them. She stood in the sun looking at them for a long moment, and the thing that burned in her chest was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was the deliberate cruelty of it, the killing of good animals for no purpose except to demonstrate that a person could be reached anywhere, that no corner of her life was beyond the syndicate's long and patient arm. She buried the steers far from the house and said nothing to anyone in town. The third thing was the man with the badge. He came alone on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 days before the Friday that would become the talk of 3 states. He sat his horse outside the gate and did not dismount, and Martha came out of the house and stood on the porch and looked at him across the yard. He was younger than she'd expected. 30, perhaps 32. Lean build, worn clothes, a deputy's badge pinned slightly crooked on his vest. He had the kind of stillness that certain men develop, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of controlled readiness, a coiled quality that you noticed in the way he held his hands and the way his eyes moved over her property before they settled on her face. "Mrs. Crane," he said. His voice was flat and professional, with no warmth in it and no cruelty either, just the neutral tone of a man delivering a message he has delivered before. "Name's Cole Hendricks. I'm here regarding the outstanding tax obligation on this property. I want to give you notice in person. Vacate by Friday sundown. I'll return with a writ of seizure and sufficient men to enforce it." Martha said nothing. She watched him. "You understand what I'm telling you," he said. It was not a question. "How many men?" Martha said. Hendricks looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, an adjustment, a slight recalculation. She had not cried, had not begged, had not asked about the legality of the papers or appealed to his decency. She had asked a tactical question, and they both knew it. He filed that information somewhere and chose to dismiss it. "Enough," he said. He looked at the property one more time. He looked at the house, the barn, the kitchen garden, the fence line. His right hand rested on his thigh close to the holster, but not on it. A professional posture, practiced. And then he did something small. Before he turned his horse, his fingers dropped to the handle of his pistol and tapped it twice. 1, 2. A light double tap on the grip, barely noticeable, as natural and unconscious as a man adjusting his hat. Martha's breath stopped. She had not seen that habit in over 20 years. She had not thought about it in over 20 years. It was not a common habit. She had never seen it in anyone else. It was specific and particular, the kind of physical reflex that gets into a person's hands during the process of learning and never fully leaves. She had taught it herself. Check the balance before you draw. 2 taps. You'll always know if something's wrong before your hand commits. She had said those words in a dusty lot behind a performance tent in Dodge City to a 12-year-old boy with sharp blue eyes who had been watching her practice for 3 days straight before she finally waved him over. That was 1864. She had not thought about that boy since. She stood on her porch and watched Cole Hendricks ride away, and the afternoon light stretched his shadow long across the dry grass, and the sound of his horse faded into the wind, and Martha Crane stood very still for a long time after he was gone. Then she walked to the barn. She moved the hay bales that had not been moved in 30 years, and she looked down at the trunk in the corner, the one sealed with a single leather cord, the one she had closed the month before her wedding, and told herself she would never open again. She did not open it that evening. She only looked at it, but something in her chest had already made its decision in the quiet, wordless way that the deepest decisions are always made not in the mind, but somewhere older than the mind, somewhere that remembers everything. Outside, the creek ran on through the cooling evening. Friday was 4 days away. She opened it before dawn. Not that night she only looked at it as we said, but the next morning before the sun had cleared the mountains, and while the ranch was still gray and cold and quiet, Martha lit the barn lamp and carried it to the corner and set it on the ground beside the trunk. She knelt in the hay and untied the leather cord with hands that did not hurry and did not hesitate. The cord had been tied for 30 years. It came loose easily. The smell that rose from the open trunk was specific and unmistakable: gun oil and old leather, and something dry and faintly sweet that might have been the cedar lining, or might have been the particular smell of a life that had been folded up and stored away in the dark. Martha sat back on her heels and looked at what was inside. The program was on top. Not a poster, a folded performance program, the kind they printed by the hundreds and handed out at the door before shows. The paper had gone soft at the folds, and the ink had faded to brown at the edges, but the print was still legible in the lamplight. Colonel Beaumont's Wild West exhibition, an authentic frontier experience. The list of acts ran down the page in order of appearance. Second from the top, in slightly larger type than the others, was a name she had not seen written down in 3 decades. May Kellerman. Precision marksmanship. Don't blink. That last part had been added by hand in pencil in someone else's handwriting. She did not remember who had written it. She had never known who had written it. It had simply appeared on the programs one season and stayed there, and the audiences had laughed and then stopped laughing when she began to shoot. She set the program aside. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the moisture out faithfully for 30 years, were the guns. Two Colt single-action Army revolvers, the cavalry model, with barrels cut to 4 3/4 inches for speed. The grips were walnut, worked by a craftsman in Abilene who had done custom work for 3 of the exhibition's performers, and the scroll work on the back straps had been her own design, a simple vine pattern that she had drawn on paper and handed to him without explanation. They were not showpieces. They were working tools built to exact specifications and maintained with professional care, and even after 30 years in a sealed trunk, when she lifted the first one and turned it in the lamplight, it looked like something that meant business. She held it in her right hand. She waited to feel something, guilt perhaps, or grief, or the particular vertigo of touching the past after a long separation. What she felt instead was the weight of it settling into her palm with a familiarity so complete it was almost like an insult. 30 years, a marriage and a life and a man in the ground on the hill, and 30 seasons of calving and fencing and harvest and winter, all of that in her hand remembered this grip as though she had set it down yesterday. The hand does not care about decisions. The hand only remembers what it has practiced 10,000 times. She turned the cylinder, smooth. She checked the action. Clean and dry but not damaged. The oilcloth had done its work. She would need to clean and oil both guns before they were ready to fire, but the mechanisms were intact. She set the first Colt down gently on the oilcloth, picked up the second. Same weight, same balance, same unhesitating recognition in her palm. The barn was very quiet around her. The horses shifted in their stalls. The lamp threw a small circle of yellow light in the gray dark. Martha Crane knelt in the hay with a gun in each hand and looked at the program lying beside the trunk, at the faded name printed there, and for a long moment she was neither Martha nor May, but something older than both names, just a woman with a decision already made in her bones, waiting for the rest of her to catch up. She began to clean the guns. The memory came while her hands were working. That was how it always happened, not when she went looking for it, but when her hands were occupied with something familiar and her mind was quiet enough to let the past move through. Boise, Idaho, September of 1872. Not a performance day. The afternoon before the day, the tent was still being staked and the crew was arguing about the rigging for the aerial act, and the lot behind the performance ground was empty except for the horses and the equipment wagons and May Kellerman, who had come out to practice, because practice was what she did and what she had always done. She had been with the Beaumont exhibition for 2 years by then. She was 22 years old and she was very good at her work, and she knew it without vanity, the way a carpenter knows the quality of a joint or a rider knows the quality of a horse, as simple fact assessed and noted and moved past. She stood at the far end of the practice lot and drew the right-hand Colt 17 times in succession. Each draw was clean. Each draw was fast. Each was, as far as she could judge, essentially identical to the one before. On the 18th draw, she stopped with the gun extended and held it there and looked at it. She was trying to remember the last time the drawing had felt like anything. Not the performance. Performance was different. Performance had the crowd and the lights and the particular electricity of people watching you do something they could not do. But the practice, the 10,000 repetitions that built the performance. She was trying to remember the last time a clean draw had felt like achievement rather than maintenance, like progress rather than repetition. She lowered the gun and stood in the September afternoon and understood without drama or self-pity that she was tired. Not physically tired, her body was 22 and strong, and she could practice for another 4 hours if she chose to. She was tired of the thing itself, tired of the particular shape her life had taken and the way it kept taking the same shape no matter what city she woke up in. She holstered the gun and stood there looking at nothing for a long moment. Then she heard boots on the dry grass behind her and turned to find a man she had not seen before standing a respectful distance back, watching with the expression of someone who has been watching for a while and has not quite decided whether to announce himself. He was perhaps 30, plainly dressed, the kind of plain that comes from preference rather than poverty. He had quiet eyes and a way of standing that took up exactly the space he needed and no more. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "I was looking for the advance ticket office and came around the wrong side of the lot." "It's that building," May said and pointed. He nodded. He looked at the gun on her hip and then back at her face. "Can I ask you something?" She waited. "What do you like to do," he said, "when you're not doing this?" It was such an unexpected question that for a moment she had no answer at all. People asked about the shooting, the technique, the speed, the trick work. People asked about the traveling and the exhibitions and the famous people she had met. Nobody had ever asked her what she liked to do when she wasn't performing. She realized, standing in that lot in the September afternoon, that she did not have a ready answer. And the absence of that answer told her something she had been not knowing for a long time. "I'm not sure," she said. The man looked at her steadily, not with pity and not with judgment, just with the clear attention of someone listening to what you actually said rather than what they expected you to say. "My name is Jacob Crane," he said. "I have land in Montana, good land, a creek that runs year-round." He paused. No audience. She looked at him for a long moment. "Go get your ticket," she said. "I'll be at the show tonight." He smiled a small, unhurried smile and went to find the ticket office. May Kellerman holstered her gun and looked out across the empty practice lot and felt something shift in her chest, small and quiet like a door opening in a room she had forgotten existed. 3 months later she married him in a church in Bozeman with a congregation of 12 people and wore a dress she had bought off a rack in a dry goods store and thought it was the finest thing she had ever worn in her life. Martha's hands finished with the first gun. She set it down and picked up the second and kept working, and the memory receded the way memories do not gone, but return to wherever they live when they are not being visited. Outside the ranch was waking up, birds in the cottonwoods, the horses wanting their morning grain. The creek as always running its steady sound beneath everything. She thought about Jacob. She thought about the 8 months since November, the specific quality of silence in a house where someone used to be. The chair across the kitchen table that she still set a cup in front of sometimes without thinking, reaching for the second cup before she remembered there was no one to give it to. The way she still said "we" sometimes when talking to the horses or the chickens as though he were still somewhere on the property and would be along shortly. She thought about the last night. November. The bedroom cold, despite the stove. Jacob's breathing had been laboring for 3 days by then, each breath a visible effort, his chest working hard for something the air wasn't fully providing anymore. The doctor had come and gone and left nothing useful except the knowledge that nothing could be done. Martha had sat beside the bed through the night. She was not a woman who reached easily for sentiment. 30 years of hard living had shaped her toward the practical, toward what could be done with what was available. But she had held his hand through those dark hours and been grateful for the warmth still in it. Near dawn, he had opened his eyes and found her there without surprise, as though he had known all along she would be exactly in that place. "Martha," he said. His voice was different, stripped down the way a voice gets when a person is past the point of wasting breath on anything but what matters. "I'm here," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know what you came from. I always knew. I never worried about it. You were the bravest person I ever met, and that was part of why." He paused for breath. "But I need you to promise me something." She waited. "Don't go back to it," he said. "Whatever happens after I'm gone, whatever they do or don't do, stay gentle, Martha. Promise me you'll stay gentle." The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the first gray light was beginning to show at the window. "I promise," she said. He closed his eyes. He was gone before the sun came fully up. Martha set the second gun down on the oilcloth. Both Colts cleaned both cylinders, turning smoothly, both actions moving the way they were supposed to move. She loaded them carefully, checking each cartridge before it went in the way she had been taught, and the way she had practiced, and the way her hands knew without being told. Then she sat back and looked at what she had done. "I promise," she had said. She sat in the barn in the early morning light with 2 loaded guns in front of her, and Jacob 300 yards away under a hillside stone, and thought about the nature of promises. Whether a promise made to a dying man was a binding contract or a mercy. Whether Jacob, who had known her better than anyone alive or dead, would understand the distinction between the spirit of what he had asked and the letter of it. Whether staying gentle was something you could do while simultaneously preparing to shoot 3 men if necessary. She did not reach a clean answer. She suspected there wasn't one. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to the barn in the morning and the man on the hill. You knew me better than I knew myself, Jacob. You know I don't have another way." The horses shifted in their stalls. A sparrow moved in the rafters above her. Martha picked up the guns, wrapped them in the oilcloth, and carried them to the house. She had 3 days. The first day she spent with the guns themselves, not shooting, not yet, but handling, working the actions, practicing the draw from the belt rig she had found at the bottom of the trunk, the leather stiff from years but still sound. Drawing and holstering in the kitchen and the yard, and the empty space behind the barn, letting her hands remember what her mind had spent 30 years not thinking about. It came back faster than she wanted it to. That was the thing about physical memory. It had no patience for the decisions of the conscious mind. She had spent 3 decades being Martha Crane Rancher's wife, quiet woman of Stillwater Bend, a person who could ride and rope and do the 10,000 practical things that frontier life demanded. She had been genuinely that person. She had not been pretending. But May Kellerman had not disappeared. She had only been waiting with the particular patience of something that does not need to breathe. By the end of the first day, the draw was back. Clean and fast and automatic, her left hand coming across in the cross draw that had been her signature technique, faster than a standard draw for a right-handed shooter, disorienting to anyone who expected the conventional motion. She stood in the yard in the late afternoon with both guns drawn and looked at her hands and felt something she did not have a clean name for. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something older and more complicated. The recognition of what she was after a long time of being something else. The second day she walked her land. She walked it the way a general walks a battlefield before the engagement, not with sentiment, but with calculation. She counted her steps from the gate to the porch. 43. She measured the sight lines from the porch to the various points in the yard where men might stand. She noted the angle of the afternoon light, where it would be in the eyes of men facing west at sundown and where it would be in hers. She moved furniture inside the house. The kitchen table 3 feet to the left, giving a clear angle from the window to the gate. She repositioned a chair near the front window for a view of the yard's full width. Then she stood on the porch and thought about how 3 men would move. Men who had done this kind of work before, and Hendricks had, she was certain of that, would spread into a triangle. 1 man forward, 2 men flanking at 45-degree angles. Classic formation. It gave crossfire coverage and prevented a single target from addressing all threats with one movement. She had seen that formation before. She had practiced against it before in the years when the exhibition had included a mock gunfight sequence and Colonel Beaumont had insisted on realistic staging. 3 men at triangle spacing at the distances the yard allowed in the light of a Friday sundown. She stood on the porch and worked through it in her mind, clean and cold and methodical, the way she had always worked through difficult shots, not with emotion, but with geometry. Left flank first. Always take the flanking threat before the center. The center man would be the fastest. He always was, but the flanking men were the immediate danger if they got their shots off. Left flank, right flank, center. 3 shots, 2 guns in whatever time the situation allowed. She stood on the porch for a long time. Then she went inside and made supper and ate it at the kitchen table in the lamplight alone and washed the dishes and went to bed. On the 3rd day she practiced in the actual light. Dawn and dusk. The 2 low-light conditions. She set up targets in the yard fence posts. A bucket hung from a wire. The scarecrow from the kitchen garden repurposed and relocated, and she shot at them in the gray of early morning and the orange of late evening. The specific illumination that would exist on a Friday at sundown in late spring in this particular valley. The shots were good. Not every shot. The right-hand Colt was running slightly hot after extended use, pulling a 1/4 inch to the right at 40 feet, and she adjusted for it. But good enough. More than good enough. After the last practice session, she stood in the yard in the cooling dusk and listened to the creek. The light had gone gold and then orange, and then a deep copper that turned the grass and the barn and the fence posts to the same warm color. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the pasture. The mountains in the east had gone from blue to purple. She thought about the man who had taught her to love this light. The man who had stood on this porch with her 1,000 times in evenings just like this one and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She drew both Colts one more time, clean and smooth and fast as water. She held them at her sides and looked out at the last of the evening and spoke quietly into it. "I'm sorry about the promise, Jacob," she said. "I expect you understand. You always understood me better than I deserved." The meadowlark called again. She holstered the guns and went inside to wrap them in cloth for the morning. That night in Stillwater Bend, something happened in the saloon on the main street that would matter more than anyone present understood at the time. Cole Hendricks was not a drinking man in the heavy sense, not a man who needed drink or sought it for comfort or oblivion. But he had learned long ago that a single whiskey the evening before a job settled something in the body, smoothed out whatever edge remained after the preparation was complete. It was professional maintenance, nothing more. He sat at the bar in the Stillwater Bend saloon and drank his one whiskey slowly and answered the bartender's careful questions about where he was from and what had brought him through with the polite and minimal answers of a man who had no interest in being known. The saloon was not crowded on a Thursday night. A card game in the corner, two men at the far end of the bar, a table near the window, with a rancher and his hired man talking low over their beers. And in the corner nearest the door alone, at a small table with a glass of rye he had been nursing for 2 hours, an old man with the careful stillness of someone who was listening to more of the room than he appeared to be. Hendricks noticed him because he noticed everyone. He filed him as local elderly no threat and returned his attention to his whiskey. He asked the bartender in the same tone he might ask about the weather what he knew about the widow out at the Crane Ranch. The bartender was cooperative in the careful way of men who want to be helpful without being implicated. He knew what most people knew, that she'd been out there 30-some years, that her husband had died last winter, that she kept to herself and paid her bills and didn't cause trouble for anyone. "Tough old woman," the bartender offered, "living out there alone all this time. She have any family, anybody who'd come to help her if she called for it?" The bartender shook his head. "Not that anyone knows of. She came from somewhere back east, but she never talked about it. Never had visitors from that direction." Hendricks nodded. He picked up his glass. The old man in the corner spoke without being asked. "I can tell you something about that woman," he said. His voice was unhurried, the voice of someone who had long since stopped needing to raise it to be heard. "If you're interested." Hendricks looked at him. "I'm listening." The old man, his name was Pete Harlow, and he had run the livery stable in Stillwater Bend for 31 years, turned his glass slowly on the table. He did not look at Hendricks directly when he spoke. He looked at the glass. "Fall of 1872, Pete said. "I was passing through Bozeman on my way back from a horse-buying trip up north. There was a traveling exhibition in town, Wild West show, the kind they had back then. I paid my 50 cents and went in because I had nothing else to do that evening." He paused, lifted his glass, considered it, set it back down. "They had a woman shooter. May something, I don't remember the last name now. She came out on horseback at a full gallop and shot 6 glass balls out of the air, one after another, without missing. Then she got down from the horse and shot a playing card in half at 50 yards, and then she had a man from the audience put a cigarette in his mouth, and she shot the lit end off it from 30 feet. The saloon was quiet enough that his voice carried without effort to the far corners of the room. The card game had paused. The rancher near the window was listening. "I've seen a lot of things in 68 years, Pete said. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that, before or since." Hendricks waited. "What's your point, old-timer?" Pete looked up at him then. His eyes were pale and direct and clear in the way that very old eyes sometimes are, as though age had stripped away everything except the essential. "My point," he said, "is that I have a good memory for faces. Always have. And when Martha Crane rode past my livery about 6 months after she first showed up in this valley, I looked at her face and I thought, I have seen that face before." He let the silence sit for a moment. The hair was different. The name was different. She was older, but the eyes were the same. You don't forget eyes like that. The room was very quiet. Hendricks looked at the old man for a long moment. He was good at reading people. It was a professional requirement, and what he read in Pete Harlow's face was not the performance of a man telling a dramatic story for the benefit of the audience. It was the discomfort of a man saying something he had kept to himself for a long time, for reasons that were now outweighed by reasons to speak. "You're saying the widow is this woman shooter?" Hendricks said. "From a circus show, 20 years ago." "I'm saying what I saw," Pete said. "You can do with it what you think best." Hendricks nodded slowly. He paid for his drink and stood up. "I appreciate the story," he said. His voice was even and polite and gave away nothing. He walked out of the saloon into the cool night air and stood on the boardwalk for a moment looking up at the dark street. The mountains were invisible in the dark, present only as an absence of stars along the horizon. He thought about the old man's story. He thought about the widow on the porch, the stillness of her, the quality of her silence, the question she had asked. How many men? He thought about every job he had done like this one. Old women mostly, widows mostly, people without options and without allies, alone on parcels of land that were worth more to someone else than to them. He had never had a problem. He had never had more than words and the implicit understanding of what the alternative to words was. He was a practical man. He dealt in what was real and what was demonstrable. A woman who had done trick shooting in a traveling exhibition 20 years ago was not the same thing as a threat to 3 armed and experienced men. The old man's story, however genuine, described someone from another time. People got old. They got slow. They got afraid. He had read her face twice now. He had seen the stillness that the old man seemed to think was significant. But Hendricks had his own interpretation of that stillness. It was the stillness of a woman who had already given up, who was buying time because she didn't know what else to do. Tomorrow he would bring Dobbs and Tully. He would make it clean and quick and professional. The widow would leave because she would have no other option, and if she chose not to leave, the outcome would be the same, only messier. He went to his room, and he lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark. He did not sleep easily. He was not sure why. At some point before dawn, he thought about the tap he always gave the grip of his gun before a draw. 1-2. The habit was so old he could not remember learning it. It had simply always been there, as natural as breathing, and he had never met anyone else who did the same thing. He thought about that for a moment, then he stopped thinking about it because it was nothing. A habit he had picked up somewhere along the way. It didn't mean anything. He closed his eyes. Friday morning was coming. Martha was already awake when the sun came up. She dressed in her work clothes, the same clothes she wore for every day on the ranch, because this was a day on the ranch, and she would meet it as herself. She braided her hair and pinned it back. She built the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window while it heated and looked out at the yard in the early light. The wrapped cloth bundle sat on the kitchen table behind her. She had put it there the night before so that she would not have to think about it this morning. The thinking was done. The preparation was done. All that remained was the day itself, and the day would go the way it went. She poured her coffee and drank it at the table. Jacob's chair was empty across from her. She looked at it for a moment, then looked out the window again. The creek caught the morning sun and threw it back in pieces. The mountains were pink at their tops. A hawk was working the thermals above the eastern pasture, high up and unhurried, riding the invisible architecture of the air. "Stay gentle," Jacob had said. She had tried. For 30 years she had tried, and she had largely succeeded, and the life they had built together in that time was real, and was not a performance, and was not a lie. May Kellerman had not been pretending to be Martha Crane. Martha Crane had been the truest version of herself she had ever managed. But truth has more than one layer, and the layer underneath the gentleness had been there all along, patient as stone, waiting to see if it would ever be needed. It was going to be needed. She finished her coffee, washed the cup, dried it, and put it back on the shelf. She picked up the cloth bundle from the table and carried it out to the porch and set it on the rail to her left, within easy reach. Then she sat down in the porch chair and looked out at the gate. The sky above the mountains had gone from pink to gold to the high, clear blue of a Montana morning. Somewhere to the east, Cole Hendricks was saddling his horse. Martha settled into her chair and waited, the way she had always known how to wait, completely, still completely present, with the particular quality of patience that is not passive but purposeful. The patience of someone who has made all the decisions that can be made and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up. The creek ran on. Friday had arrived. They came at sundown, exactly as she had known they would. 3 riders on the eastern road, moving at a deliberate walk, their silhouettes sharp against the last of the day's light. Martha had been watching the road since mid-afternoon, not with anxiety, but with the focused attention of someone tracking weather, noting the quality of the light, the direction of the wind, the way the shadows were falling across the yard. She had moved the cloth bundle from the porch rail to her lap an hour before they appeared. Now she set it back on the rail and rested her hand beside it, and watched them come. The sky behind them was the color of hammered copper. Not a soft sunset, a hard one, the kind that makes the air feel dense and the distances deceptive. The mountains to the west had gone black against it. The creek in the pasture below the house caught the light and threw it back like a blade. She could identify Hendricks by his posture at a quarter mile. The way he sat his horse upright, economical, with the particular stillness of a man who spent a great deal of time on horseback and had long since stopped thinking about it. The two men flanking him were less familiar. She watched their body language as the distance closed. The one to the left rode with a slight forward lean that suggested eagerness or nerves or both. The one to the right sat back in his saddle, relaxed, the posture of a man who believed in the outcome before it had happened. 40 yards from the gate they slowed to a stop. The three of them sat their horses in a line and looked at the property and at the woman on the porch. There was a brief, inaudible exchange between them, Hendricks saying something short, the other two nodding. Then they dismounted together in the smooth, practiced way of men who had done this kind of work before. Hendricks tied his horse to the fence post. The other two did the same. They came through the gate in a loose formation that spread naturally as they moved across the yard, Hendricks forward and center, the lean forward man drifting left, the relaxed one angling right. A triangle exactly as Martha had mapped in her mind 3 days ago, the spacing opening up as they advanced. She noted the distances as they settled. Hendricks center, 30 feet. The man on the left, she would learn later his name was Frank Dobbs, 40 feet, and continuing to drift wider. The man on the right, Ray Tully, 45 feet, stopped, now his weight on his back foot. 30, 40, 45, within 5 feet of what she had calculated. She did not move. She kept her hand on the porch rail beside the cloth bundle and looked at Hendricks and waited. He looked different in the fading light than he had on Wednesday, more settled. The professional calm that came from a man arriving at a job he had done before and expected to finish without complication. His badge caught the last of the copper light and threw a small bright point across the yard. "Mrs. Crane," he said. His voice carried easily in the still evening air. "Last chance to make this simple. Walk away tonight with what you can carry. I'll see you get to town safely." Martha said nothing. Hendricks waited a reasonable number of seconds. "The legal process is complete. This property transfers at sundown. That's now." Still nothing. He took 2 steps forward, 28 feet. "I've got a writ of seizure signed by the county judge," he said. "I've got 2 deputies, and I've got all night." He paused. "You've got nothing, Mrs. Crane. Your husband's gone. Nobody's coming to help you. It's time to be sensible." Martha looked at him. She looked at the face she had been looking at for 5 days now. The sharp angles of it, the blue eyes that were professional and flat, and utterly without doubt. She looked at his hands where his right hand had drifted to the familiar position near his holster, not gripping yet, just resting close the way a man rests his hand near a tool he expects to need. And she looked at his face one more time. The blue eyes. The 12-year-old boy with those same sharp blue eyes standing outside the exhibition fence in the Kansas dust, watching her practice for 3 days before she finally waved him over. "Come here, kid. I'll show you one thing." She had shown him one thing. The 2-tap check. The balance test before the draw. 1-2, and you always know if something's wrong before your hand commits. She had shown it to him because he had been watching with such focused attention that she had felt in the way you sometimes feel with a young person that the knowledge would find good use in him. She had not asked why he wanted to know how to shoot. She had not thought about where that knowledge might take him. She had been 22 years old and generous with her skill, and she had not understood yet that the things you give away do not always become the things you intended. She looked at him standing in her yard with 2 men flanking him and a forged writ in his pocket, and thought, "I put something in you that helped make you this." It was not a paralyzing thought. It was not even a surprising thought by now. It was simply a true thing that she had to hold alongside everything else she was holding in this moment. "You got nothing to say," Hendricks said. His voice had taken on a sharper edge, not anger, impatience, the impatience of a man whose schedule is being delayed by someone who doesn't understand the situation. Your husband isn't here to protect you anymore, old woman. That part of your life is done. The yard was very quiet. Martha's hand moved to the cloth bundle on the rail. What happened next took 4 seconds. She knew that afterward, the way you know the duration of something only once it's finished, because inside those 4 seconds there was no sense of time passing at all. There was only the sequence of things, each one following the one before, with the clean inevitability of arithmetic. She pulled the cloth loose and let it fall. The 2 Colts were in her hands before the cloth hit the porch boards. Not drawn from a holster lifted from the rail where they had been sitting, which was faster, which was why she had placed them there. Her left hand came up first in the cross-draw motion, the barrel finding its line the way water finds the lowest point in a slope. Hendricks went still. For the first time since he had ridden onto this property 5 days ago, something moved in his face that was not professional confidence. It was something older and less controlled. On the left, Frank Dobbs saw the guns and did what a frightened man does. He reached. His hand dropped to his holster faster than a cautious man would have moved, but not fast enough, which is the arithmetic that governs these situations. His hand was moving down when Martha's left hand was already up. The shot came from 40 feet with the barrel level and true, and Dobbs was hit center mass before his gun cleared leather. The impact turned him sideways, and he went down without a sound face first into the dirt of the yard and did not move. 1. Martha pivoted right. The motion was not hurried, and it was not slow. It was simply efficient. The pivot of a person who has done this movement until it is no longer a movement but a reflex, until the body executes it without requiring the mind to issue the instruction. Ray Tully was 45 feet away, and he was already halfway into his draw when she found him. Halfway into his draw was not far enough. She saw his face in the fraction of a second available. Young, she registered younger than she had thought, and white with something that was not quite terror and not quite surprise, but was the specific look of a man who has just understood that the situation is not what he was told it would be. His gun hand was coming up. Her second shot caught him in the shoulder before the barrel of his gun was horizontal, and the force of it knocked him backward and down, and his gun fell from his hand into the dust. 2. Hendricks. He was fast. She had known he would be fast. She had felt it in the quality of his stillness from the first day he rode onto her property, the coiled readiness of a man who had earned his speed through practice and had used it to lethal effect. He had been drawing while she was pivoting right, using the fraction of a second she had spent on Tully to get his own gun clear. Martha saw the barrel coming up and moved. Not far, not dramatically. A slight drop of her knees and a shift of her weight left the kind of movement that doesn't look like much and changes everything. She had practiced this too in those 3 days because she had known Hendricks was the one who would get a shot off. She had planned for it. The report of his pistol cracked through the evening air, and the porch post to her left exploded in a spray of splinters that stung her cheek and her neck. The bullet had passed close enough that she felt the displaced air of it. She was already firing. Her third shot took Hendricks high in the chest left of center. He stood. For a moment that seemed longer than the 4 seconds that had contained everything else, Cole Hendricks stood in the yard of the Crane Ranch and looked down at his chest. His gun was in his hand, and he was still standing, and his mind, which was a practical and disciplined mind, was working through what had just happened with the methodical attention he brought to all things. He looked at the spreading red on his shirt. He looked up at Martha on the porch. She saw it happen in his eyes. The arithmetic completing itself. The old man in the saloon, the woman shooter with the cross draw and the eyes that didn't change. The habit he had carried in his hands for 20 years, the one he couldn't remember learning, the one he had never questioned, because it had always simply been there. He understood. She watched him understand. It watched the recognition move through his face in the last seconds available to him. Not just that he had made a mistake in coming here. Something older than that. The longer thread of it. The way things connect across years without your knowledge or consent. She did not look away. Hendricks' legs went out from under him, and he sat down heavily in the dust, and then he was on his back, and then he was still. The echo of the 3 shots faded into the evening air, rolling away across the pasture and the creek and the flat grassland beyond, diminishing with distance until the valley swallowed them whole. The powder smoke drifted. The creek ran on indifferent as it always had. Martha stood on the porch and breathed. Her left arm was burning. She looked at it and found that Hendricks's bullet in passing close enough to move her hair had also grazed the outside of her forearm. Not deep, but real. A clean cut through the fabric of her sleeve and the skin beneath it that was bleeding freely down into her palm. She had not felt it until this moment. She felt it now. The webbing between her right thumb and forefinger had split from the recoil of the old Colt. That hand was bleeding too. She stood for a moment and took stock of herself with the same methodical attention she would give to any damaged thing on the ranch, assessing what was serious and what was not, what needed immediate attention and what could wait. The arm could wait. The hand could wait. She stepped down off the porch. She moved to Dobbs first because he had been the most immediate threat and because she needed to know. She knelt and checked him. He was gone. The shot had been placed well more accurately than she had consciously aimed, the product of years of practice expressing itself below the level of intention. She stood up. Tully was alive. He was lying on his back in the dust, gripping his shoulder with his good hand, his face clenched against the pain, his gun lying 3 feet away. He was conscious and aware, and when Martha walked toward him, his eyes tracked her with the focused intensity of a man taking careful inventory of his situation. She kicked his gun further away and stood over him. "Can you ride?" she said. He stared at her. His breathing was shallow and fast. "I asked if you can ride," she said again. Her voice was the same voice she used to ask a hired hand if he had checked the fence line. Calm, specific, expecting an answer. "Yes," Tully managed. The word came out rough. "Then here is what you're going to do," Martha said. "I'm going to help you onto your horse. You're going to ride east, and you're going to keep riding until you reach Stillwater Bend. You're going to go to the doctor, and then you're going to tell people what happened here. Exactly what happened. Nothing added, nothing left out." Tully looked up at her. His face was white and sheened with sweat, and his shoulder was bleeding badly, soaking through his shirt and down his arm. He was in serious pain, and he was frightened, and he was 28 years old, and he was very far from wherever he had imagined his life going when he had signed on with Cole Hendricks 3 weeks ago. "You understand me," Martha said. He nodded. A quick, urgent movement. She reached down and took his good arm and helped him to his feet. He was heavier than he looked, and she had to work against her own injury to do it, the cut in her forearm, pulling and burning. She got him standing, and then she walked him to his horse at the fence post, and she held the horse steady while he worked himself up into the saddle with his one functioning arm. He sat slumped above her, pale as paper, his right arm hanging useless at his side. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him. There was a long moment in which neither of them said anything. Around them the evening was settling into dark. The copper light nearly gone, the first stars showing above the eastern mountains. The yard was quiet except for the horses and the distant creek and the sound of Tully's labored breathing. "She said you were just a widow," Tully said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They said it would be simple." Martha said nothing. "Who are you?" he said. She looked up at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the horse. "Ride," she said. Tully rode. She watched him go through the gate and onto the eastern road, slumped forward over the saddle horn, his horse moving at a careful walk, as though it understood the fragility of its rider. She watched until the darkness took him, and then she listened until the sound of the hoofbeats faded, and then the night was quiet again. She turned back to the yard. She dealt with what had to be dealt with. It took several hours working slowly because of her arm, and because the tasks were heavy, and because there was no one to help her, and there never would be anyone to help her with something like this. She worked by lamplight and then by moonlight, when the lamp began to run low, steady, and methodical, taking each thing as it came. At some point in the middle of it, her hands found the photograph. She was moving Dobbs. She had to move him twice before she found the right place far back near the cottonwoods where the ground was soft enough to dig, and her hand caught on something in his chest pocket. She stopped and reached in and pulled it out, a photograph small enough to fit in a palm. Old soft at the corners, The image faded to a silvery gray in the moonlight. A child, a girl, maybe 3 years old, maybe 4, sitting somewhere bright and squinting against the light with the unstudied happiness of very young children who have not yet learned to perform for a camera. Martha looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about the fact that this particular man who had ridden onto her property tonight with a gun on his hip and bad intentions had carried this photograph in his chest pocket, had carried it close to whatever was closest to him, had kept it there through the weeks and months of this job, through the fence cutting and the poisoned water trough and the forged papers, through the ride to Stillwater Bend and the drinks in the saloon and the final crossing of her gate. She did not know his story. She did not know the girl's name or where she lived, or whether she knew her father was lying in a stranger's yard in Montana. She did not know whether Dobbs was a bad man who loved someone good, or a weak man who had made bad choices, or something else entirely that she lacked the information to understand. She knew that a child existed who had a father, and the father was here. She placed the photograph back in his pocket and folded the fabric over it carefully. Then she finished what she had to finish. When everything that could be done that night was done, Martha went to the well and drew water and began to wash her hands. The cut on her forearm needed proper attention. She would clean and bandage it inside once she was done out here. The hand had already slowed its bleeding. She stood at the well and washed her hands in the cold water and listened to the creek. The creek ran on the way it always ran, clear and cold from the mountains, moving over stones in the dark, indifferent to everything that had happened in the last few hours. It had been running through this valley since before there were people to hear it, and it would be running through this valley long after the last person who remembered tonight had gone to their own hillside stone. Jacob had said, "As long as you can hear that creek, you're home." She listened to it. She was still here. The land was still hers. The creek was still running. She had broken a promise to the man she loved most in this world, and she had done it with full knowledge and clear intention, and she would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life. And the land was still hers. Jacob's grave was still on the hillside. The barn still leaned north from 3 decades of wind. The kitchen table was still in the kitchen with 2 chairs and the habit of setting 2 cups, even when there was only one person to drink from them. She had kept the thing he loved by breaking the promise he'd asked her to keep. She stood at the well for a long time. Then she wrapped her forearm with a strip of cloth from the kitchen and went to bed. Ray Tully reached Stillwater Bend before midnight. The doctor's lamp was still lit. Doc Emery kept late hours by habit and necessity, and Tully came through the door sideways, half falling, held up by the doorframe, and whatever stubbornness was keeping him conscious. The doctor and his wife got him onto the table, and the doctor went to work on the shoulder, which was serious but manageable, the bullet having passed cleanly through muscle without striking bone. While the doctor worked, Tully talked. He talked the way a man talks when he has been holding something inside himself under pressure, and the pressure has been released not all at once, but in a steady, unstoppable flow. He told the doctor and the doctor's wife, and later the deputy, who came in response to the noise, exactly what had happened at the Crane Ranch that evening. He did not embellish. He did not minimize. He described the woman on the porch and the cloth bundle and the guns coming out, and he described what had happened to Dobbs and what had happened to Hendricks, and he described the 4 seconds in the same way he would describe them for the rest of his life, with a quality of wonder in his voice that never entirely went away. "She drew both of them at once," he told the deputy. "Cross draw left hand first. I never saw anything like it. I've been around men who were fast. Hendricks was faster than anybody I'd worked with. She was faster." The deputy wrote things down. "And she let you go," he said. "She helped me onto my horse," Tully said. His voice held something in it that the deputy couldn't quite name. "She held the horse steady while I mounted, with a cut on her arm." The deputy looked at his notes. "She say anything to you?" Tully was quiet for a moment. The doctor's wife was wrapping his shoulder in clean bandage, and he watched her hands work. "She said to ride east and tell people what happened," he said. "Exactly what happened. Nothing added." He paused. "And then I asked her who she was." "What did she say?" "She said ride," Tully said. "That's all." The deputy closed his notebook and walked out onto the Stillwater Bend main street and stood in the night air. Down the street the saloon was still lit, its noise spilling into the quiet. He could see old Pete Harlow's light still burning in the livery. He walked to the telegraph office, which the operator kept open late on his say-so for exactly this kind of situation, and he sent a wire to Helena. Then he walked back down the street and turned in the direction of the livery because he had some questions for an old man who had, he was beginning to understand, known considerably more than he'd let on. By morning, all of Stillwater Bend knew. The story moved through the town the way stories always move through small towns in places where news travels slowly, and the listening is sharp through the early risers at the bakery, and the men hitching teams in front of the hardware store, and the women exchanging it on doorsteps with the particular efficiency of people for whom information is currency and community. The shape of the story was simple enough. 3 armed men had gone to the Crane Ranch Friday evening to forcibly seize the property. 2 of them were in the ground. One of them had ridden back to town with a bullet in his shoulder and a story that nobody had heard before and nobody would forget. Martha Crane had outdrew 3 armed men before they could bring their guns to bear. The shape beneath the story was more complicated. That shape was just beginning to form in people's minds, assembled from fragments Pete Harlow's old story about the exhibition shooter, the 2-holster carry that Tully described, the cross-draw motion that apparently no one in Stillwater Bend had seen before, and the specific calibrated precision of what had happened in that yard. Who was she? That was the question the town woke up asking. On the hill above the creek, under a stone that said only his name and 2 dates, Jacob Crane had no answer to give. And 3 miles down the road, in the modest ranch house beside the water, Martha Crane had washed her hands and wrapped her arm and was already up and working when the sun came over the mountains, moving through her morning chores with the same quiet steadiness she brought to every morning, because the animals needed feeding and the water needed checking, and the land did not pause for the events of the night before. She did not go into town. She did not send word to anyone. She simply worked alone on her land in the early light, while behind her, and to the east, the town she had lived beside for 30 years tried to assemble the pieces of a story it did not yet have the language to tell. Friday was over, but it was only just beginning to mean what it was going to mean. The syndicate's response came on a Tuesday. 3 days after Friday evening, 3 days after 2 men had gone into the ground on the far corner of the Crane Ranch, and one had ridden back to Stillwater Bend with a story nobody could stop talking about. A man arrived from Helena on the morning stage. He was 40 years old and wore a good suit that had not been designed for Montana weather, and he carried a leather satchel that he held against his chest with both arms, the way a man holds something he is afraid of losing. His name was not important. He represented the Northern Land Syndicate, and he had been sent because the men who sent him had done a swift and unfavorable calculation over the weekend. The calculation was this: 2 of their hired men were dead on a widow's property. One was alive and talking, and he was talking to everyone who would listen, and the story he was telling had already reached the Helena newspaper and was being prepared for print. The widow in question had apparently been in another life a figure of some regional fame, the kind of fame that newspapers found compelling and readers found satisfying, the story of a forgotten legend returning to settle accounts. The syndicate dealt in land and water rights and legal manipulation. It did not deal in public gunfights with legendary women. It did not deal in the kind of scrutiny that came from Denver and Chicago newspapers, picking up a story and running it under headlines that made land syndicates look like villains in a stage production. They had other valleys, they had other water sources, they had a dozen other ranches in other territories where the owners were more easily managed and the newspaper coverage was less likely to be enthusiastic. The man in the good suit knocked on Martha's gate post. Martha came to the door of the house and looked at him across the yard. He introduced himself. He explained that there had been a regrettable misunderstanding regarding the tax documentation on her property. He used the word misunderstanding 4 times in 2 minutes, which was a professional record even for him. He explained that all claims against the Crane Ranch had been formally withdrawn and that the documentation to that effect was in the satchel. He apologized for any inconvenience. He mentioned carefully that the syndicate hoped this matter could be considered resolved. Martha walked across the yard and took the papers from his outstretched hand. She looked through them with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned not to trust documentation. she hadn't read herself. The language was correct, the signatures were real, the withdrawal was complete. She looked up at the man in the good suit. He was sweating despite the cool morning. He had the eyes of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had spent the coach ride from Helena hoping the briefing had overstated it. "Is there anything else?" she said. "No, Mrs. Crane." He hesitated. "I want to assure you that the syndicate—" "You've done what you came to do," Martha said. She turned and walked back to the house. The door closed behind her. The man in the good suit stood at the gate for a moment. He looked at the yard, at the dark stains near the center of it that the rain had not yet fully claimed, at the 2 horses still tied at the fence post that nobody had come to collect. He looked at the modest house and the leaning barn and the kitchen garden and the ribbon of creek glinting in the morning light below the pasture. He had been in land acquisition for 16 years. He had seen people broken and displaced and diminished by the work he did, and he had found ways to live with that knowledge. But standing at this gate on this Tuesday morning, he found that he could not quite look at the closed door of that house without feeling something he did not have a professional category for. He picked up his satchel and walked back toward the road. He did not look back. Stillwater Bend divided itself on the question of Martha Crane as small towns always divide themselves on questions that are genuinely complicated, not cleanly, not along any predictable line, but in the ragged and overlapping way of people trying to make sense of something that resists simple sense. There were those who called her a hero. They used words like courage and justice and standing up, and they told the story with the particular satisfaction of people who have always believed that the powerful could be resisted if a person was brave enough. They were proud of her in the proprietary way that communities are proud of someone who has done something remarkable in their vicinity. There were those who were frightened of her, not the open fear that announces itself, but the quieter kind, the kind that shows up as an extra foot of distance when passing on the street, as conversations that stop a half-second too soon, as invitations that are no longer extended. 2 men were dead by her hand. Whatever the justification, however clear the circumstances, that fact sat in certain people's minds like a stone in a boot, unavoidable and discomforting. What almost nobody said out loud, and what even fewer people understood, was that both groups were wrong about what Martha had done and why she had done it. The heroes faction thought she had stood up for justice, for the rights of small landowners against corrupt power, for the valley and the water and the principle that a person's legal deed meant something. She had not done it for any of those things. She had done it because Jacob Crane was buried on a hillside 300 yards from the house he had built with his own hands, and the creek he had loved ran through the heart of their property, and she had promised him in the last hours of his life, with his hand warm in hers, that she would stay gentle. And the only way to keep the spirit of that promise was to break the letter of it, to hold the land he had loved until she could choose to leave it, to make sure that when she finally walked away, it was because she decided to, and not because 3 men with a forged document had forced her. She had done it for a dead man's peace. Tully said something in the saloon on the night he could finally sit up and drink a week after Friday. The place was full, everyone wanted to hear him tell it again, and he told it because the alternative was lying awake with it alone, which was worse. He went through the 4 seconds again, the same way every time, with the same quality of stunned precision. People leaned in. People bought him drinks. At the end, someone asked him what Martha had looked like when it was over. Tully was quiet for a moment. "She didn't look like a woman who had won something," he said. "She looked like a woman who had just done something she'd been hoping she wouldn't have to do. Like she'd been holding a door shut for 30 years, and finally the thing on the other side came through anyway." He looked at his glass. "She didn't look at us like we were enemies. She looked at us the way you look at a problem you've finally solved, except you didn't want the problem to exist in the first place." The saloon was quiet for a moment. Then someone said something about the syndicate, and the conversation moved on, and nobody came back to what Tully had said. But it was the truest thing said about Martha Crane in all the years people talked about her. The newspaper in Denver ran the story under a headline that made Martha sound like a figure from a dime novel. She read it once in the copy someone left on her gatepost and then used it to line the bottom of the chicken coop. The Helena paper was more restrained and more accurate, which she appreciated in the abstract way you appreciate accuracy when it is describing something you would prefer not to have described at all. She did not speak to reporters. She did not attend the informal gathering at the church hall that some of the Valley ranchers organized to celebrate the syndicate's withdrawal. She sent a note declining, which was the most communication she offered on the subject of Friday evening for the next several years. Life on the ranch continued. The cattle needed tending, the fence needed maintenance, the kitchen garden needed planting and weeding and harvesting in its seasons. The creek ran and the mountains changed color with the year, and the barn continued its slow, stubborn lean to the north. She rode into Stillwater Bend once a month for supplies. Flour, salt, sugar, ammunition, the same list as always. The townspeople spoke to her with a quality of careful respect that had not been there before, the particular deference that communities extend to someone they are not entirely sure how to hold. She accepted it without comment, neither warmed nor troubled by it. She attended church on Sundays. She sat in the back row and left immediately after the service. The minister, a gentleman named Alcott, who had arrived in Stillwater Bend 2 years before Friday, and had therefore missed the event itself, made several attempts in the first year to extend the conversation beyond pleasantries. She was unfailingly polite and entirely unavailable. He eventually understood, with the pastoral sensitivity that good ministers develop, that what she needed from the church was the service itself, the ritual, the music, the hour of structured quiet, and not the community that surrounded it. He left her to it. She was not unhappy. That was the thing people who watched her from a distance misread. They saw the solitude and interpreted it as suffering, as the aftermath of trauma, as a woman diminished by what she had done or what she had lost, or both. But that was not what it was. She had the land, she had the creek, she had the hillside grave and the wildflowers she tended around the stone each spring, the purple and yellow ones that came back reliably year after year without being asked to. She had the mornings and the evenings and the changing light over the mountains and the work that kept her hands occupied and her mind in the present tense. She had, in some way, she would not have been able to articulate, a kind of peace that was harder and quieter and more honest than the peace she had carried before Friday, a peace that had been tested and had not broken, that knew its own cost and accepted it. The 2 Colts went back into the trunk. She carried them from the house to the barn on a Sunday morning, wrapped in the same oilcloth, and placed them where they had lived for 30 years. She retied the leather cord. She restacked the hay bales over the trunk and smoothed the surface level. She did not open the trunk again. In the summer of 1893, 8 years after Friday, a young man came to Stillwater Bend from Helena with a notebook and a letter of introduction from his newspaper. His name was Thomas Reed, and he was 26 years old, and he had the particular earnestness of a young journalist who believes that the right questions asked with sufficient sincerity will produce the right answers. He found Martha on her porch on a Tuesday afternoon and introduced himself and explained his purpose. He wanted to write about her. The story had entered a kind of regional mythology by then, told and retold in the way of frontier stories gaining texture and drama, with each telling the 4 seconds expanding in the collective memory to something closer to 10, the number of men sometimes growing in the less careful accounts. He wanted to get it right. Martha let him sit on the porch steps because it was a warm afternoon and she had nowhere urgent to be. She answered his questions about the syndicate and the forged papers and the fence cutting and the poisoned water trough. She confirmed the basic facts of Friday evening with the minimal precision necessary to answer each question and no more. Reed wrote things down. His pencil moved quickly, and his questions were intelligent, and she found herself respecting him even as she kept the door of the real story firmly closed. Then he asked the question she had been waiting for. "Do you think of yourself as a hero, Mrs. Crane?" Martha looked out at the pasture for a moment. The creek was visible from the porch as a line of green in the summer-dry grass, a ribbon of darker color winding through the brown. "I think of myself as someone who kept her word," she said, even though the keeping of it didn't look the way the word was meant. Reed wrote that down. He looked at it. He looked up at her. "I'm not sure I understand," he said. "I know," Martha said. She looked at him with the clear, settled eyes that had not changed in 30 years, that old Pete Harlow had recognized across a valley and a lifetime, and Reed felt something in the conversation that he could not quite locate, the sense of a larger thing just behind what was visible, something true and important that was not being withheld from him, so much as simply existing at a depth his questions couldn't reach. "Whose word?" he said. "What promise?" Martha was quiet for a moment. "Not mine to explain," she said. Reed waited. Nothing more came. He closed his notebook eventually and thanked her and rode back to Stillwater Bend. The article he published the following month was well written and accurate on the facts, and entirely missed the thing that mattered. The line about keeping her word appeared in his notes, but not in the final piece. He had circled it twice in pencil and then crossed it out, because without context it sounded like something he had misheard or misunderstood, and he was too careful a journalist to print something he didn't understand. The story ran without it. Arthritis came from Martha's hands in 1894, for her shoulders in 1895. It came the way hard weather comes to high country, not all at once, but steadily each season a little more than the last, until the cumulative weight of it was undeniable. By the spring of 1896, she could no longer manage the heavy work alone. Could not rope. Could not dig post holes or lift a calf, or do the dozen physical things that running even a modest ranch required. She could still ride, but not well, and not long, and the creek pasture needed daily attention that she could no longer reliably provide. She thought about it for most of that winter, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp burning and the stove ticking and the creek running its dark sound outside. She turned the question over, the way you turn a stone to see what lives beneath it, slowly making sure she was seeing what was actually there rather than what she wanted to see. She was not being driven out. That was the thing she needed to be certain of, and she was certain of it. The land was hers legally and completely, and no one was coming to take it. She was choosing with full faculties and clear eyes to leave because she could no longer care for the place properly, and a poorly cared-for ranch was a slow insult to 30 years of work. Jacob would understand that. Jacob had been above all things a practical man. She found the buyers through the land office in Stillwater Bend, a young couple named Aldous and Clara Vance, who had come out from Ohio with 2 young children, and the particular combination of energy and naivety that new country requires. They were earnest and hard-working, and a little frightened in the way of people who have committed to something large before they fully understood its size. She liked them for that. She sold the property at a fair price, enough for the small house in Stillwater Bend, and a modest income for as long as she would need it. The morning she left the ranch, she rose before dawn and moved through the rooms of the house one last time. Not with ceremony, just with attention, the way you look at something you know you are seeing for the last time. The kitchen table, the window that caught the afternoon sun from the south, the bedroom where Jacob had died and where she had slept alone for 5 years since. She left the furniture. It belonged to the place. She walked up the hillside in the early light before the sun was fully clear of the mountains. The wildflowers were beginning to come up around the base of the stone, the purple and yellow ones thicker every year as the roots spread and established themselves. She knelt and pulled the few weeds that had come up between them, working carefully with her stiff hands, taking her time. She looked at his name on the stone, the years. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said in 5 years of mornings and evenings on this hillside, nothing that the accumulated weight of all those visits hadn't already communicated in the language that exists below words, in the language of presence and return, and the simple fact of not going away. She stood up. She looked at the stone for a long moment. Then she looked down at the creek below, catching the first light of the morning clear and cold and running over its stones in the particular way it had always run, in the way it would keep running after she was gone, and after the Vances were gone, and after everyone who had ever stood on this hillside was gone. She turned and walked down the hill. She did not look back. Not because the looking would have been wrong, but because there was nothing in the looking that hadn't already been carried forward. She had everything she needed. She had always had everything she needed. Martha Crane lived in Stillwater Bend for 7 more years. She occupied a small house on the north end of the main street, close enough to the church to walk on Sundays and close enough to the general store to manage her own supplies for most of those years. She kept a kitchen garden in the yard. She kept a cat, an old gray one with a missing ear that she had found half-starved behind the livery and had taken in without particular sentiment and fed with particular regularity until it outlasted her. She was not social and she was not reclusive. She was simply herself in the quiet and specific way she had always been herself in whatever setting the world placed her. Old Pete Harlow visited her sometimes on Sunday afternoons. They would sit on her porch and drink coffee and talk about the ordinary things, the weather, the state of the road, the news from Helena. They did not talk about Friday evening. They had never talked about what Pete had said in the saloon that night, and Martha had never asked and Pete had never explained. Some things were understood between them without requiring language. Pete died in 1901. Martha attended his funeral and stood at the graveside with the small group of townspeople who had known him long enough to come. Afterward, she walked home alone in the October afternoon and sat in her kitchen for a long time without lighting the lamp. She missed him in the specific way you miss the last person who has known you across the full length of your life, not just who you had become, but who you had been before you became it. She died on a Thursday morning in April of 1903 in the small house on the north end of the main street at the age of 72. Peacefully, the doctor said. Her heart. She had been in no pain. The funeral was held on a Saturday. The minister said the words that ministers say. The congregation was small, a dozen townspeople. Clara Vance, who had ridden in from the ranch, 2 women from the church who had known Martha in the way of people who sit near each other in the same pew for years without ever quite becoming friends. When they brought her out and set the casket on the supports by the open grave, there was a small bunch of wildflowers on the lid, purple and yellow, the same kind that grew on Jacob Crane's grave up on the hillside. Nobody knew who had placed them. Nobody admitted to it. They were simply there when people arrived as though they had always been there, as though it would have been wrong for them not to be. The minister said his words, and the casket was lowered. Afterward, Clara Vance lingered by the grave while the others drifted away. She had liked Martha in the way you like someone you never quite get close enough to understand, with a respect that comes from sensing depth you aren't given access to. She stood for a moment looking at the turned earth, and then she walked home. The man from the undertaker's office found something in Martha's dress pocket when he was preparing her, a piece of paper small and folded soft from years of handling. He almost missed it. It was tucked into the inner pocket of the dress she had apparently worn often enough that it had become a kind of habit, the paper living there the way a person carries something small and important. He unfolded it. 2 words in a man's handwriting, the ink faded almost to invisibility. Stay gentle. He refolded it carefully and placed it with her effects and noted it in his records without comment, and never thought to wonder whose hand had written it or why a woman had carried it close to her heart for what must have been, from the age of the paper, most of her adult life. The creek still runs through what was once the Crane Ranch. The Vances sold the property in 1911 to a man who ran cattle through the valley for 20 years, and he sold it to another man, and the chain of ownership continued. The way it continues everywhere, names changing on documents while the land itself remains indifferent to the names. The barn finally came down in a heavy snow year. In the 1920s, the long lean to the north having gone past what the structure could sustain. The house was rebuilt twice, but the creek runs, and on the hillside under a simple stone carved by a woman's hand, the wildflowers come back every spring, purple and yellow. They have come back every spring for 60 years, and there is no reason to think they will stop. Old-timers in Stillwater Bend still tell the story of the widow who outdrew 3 men before they could bring their guns to bear. They tell it because it happened, and because it was witnessed, and because Tully lived long enough to tell it himself, dozens of times in the careful, precise way of a man who knows that what he saw was true, and wants to make sure the truth doesn't get away from him. They tell it as a story about courage mostly, about a woman standing alone against powerful men, about justice finding its way to people who thought themselves beyond it. That story is true. As far as it goes, that story is completely true. But Billy Ames, who was 12 years old on the Saturday morning when all he saw was a woman at a well and 2 mounds of fresh earth and 2 horses with no riders, Billy Ames, who grew old in that valley and watched the story change shape with each retelling. Billy Ames always told it differently. When his grandchildren asked him to tell the story of the widow of Stillwater Bend, he would sit for a moment before he began the way you sit before saying something you want to get exactly right. He would not start with the guns. He would start with the woman at the well. The way she stood in the early morning quiet washing hands that the water couldn't seem to clean with a white bandage on her arm, and the creek running clear and cold in the pasture behind the house. He would describe the stillness of her, the way she didn't turn around when she heard him stop, the way her voice was calm and certain when she told him there was nothing here that needed looking at. She didn't look like a woman who had won something, he would say, and the grandchildren would recognize the echo of Tully's words which had been passed down through the years like the story itself. She looked like a woman who had finished something, like she had made good on a debt nobody else even knew she owed. The grandchildren would think about that. But who did she owe it to? One of them asked once. Billy was quiet for a long moment. A man on a hill, he said, a man who knew her better than she knew herself, and a promise she broke in order to keep. The grandchild thought about this. That doesn't make sense. No, Billy said. It doesn't. He looked out at the evening, at the mountains going blue in the distance, at the long light coming off the grass. That's why we keep telling it. The creek runs on. The wildflowers come back every spring, and some lines once drawn don't get crossed.